Across deserts, frozen forests, and submerged coastlines, the Earth keeps secrets it never fully explains. A grid of holes cut into Peruvian rock with no agreed purpose. A mountain in Karelia locals call alive. Stone jars scattered across a Laotian plain, holding the dead for reasons lost to time. A cave carved with symbols no one can fully translate, and structures found where no one expected structures at all. 10 places. 10 mysteries archaeologists still argue over. Tonight we walk through each one. What was found, what's missing, and what still doesn't add up. Let's get into it. High in the arid hills of Peru's Pisco Valley, carved into a hillside facing the Pacific, lies one of South America's strangest archaeological features. From above, it looks almost like a zipper stitched into the earth. A long, narrow band of roughly 5,000 to 6,000 shallow pits, arranged in parallel rows that stretch for nearly half a mile across uneven terrain. Locals call it Monte Sierpe, Band of Holes in English, and for centuries it has sat largely ignored, a curiosity mentioned only in passing by explorers who had no real explanation for what they were looking at. Each hole is small, most no more than a meter across, set close enough together that the rows seem deliberate, almost rhythmic. They run in formation up and down the slope, organized into segments rather than one continuous line. This isn't a natural rock formation. Someone built this. The question is who, and more puzzlingly, why anyone would spend the labor required to dig thousands of pits into hillside stone with no obvious payoff, no water source, no buried treasure, no remains. The mainstream explanation, the one most archaeologists lean toward, is storage. Some researchers believe the holes were used by pre-Incan or Incan societies as a kind of communal granary system, a place to store maize, quinoa, or other goods, possibly tied to trade or tribute collection along ancient routes. There's some support for this. Traces of pollen and plant residue have been found in soil samples taken from several pits, hinting that crops, or at least plant material, were once kept there. If that's the answer, Monte Sierpe would have functioned almost like a massive open-air ledger, a physical record of what was given, stored, or owed. But here's where it gets less tidy. If this was simple storage, why build it on a slope, exposed to wind and rain instead of somewhere more sheltered? Why arrange the holes with such geometric consistency in patterns some researchers have compared, loosely and not without controversy, to the layout of quipu, the knotted cord systems Andean cultures used for record-keeping and accounting? Could Monte Sierpe be something closer to a ledger carved into the land itself, a physical accounting system stretched across a hillside instead of knotted into string? It's an intriguing idea. It's also, so far, unproven. And then there are theories that drift further from consensus. Some who study the site point to its position along what may have been a pre-Columbian trade corridor and suggest the holes once marked a marketplace, where goods were measured out hole by hole in a kind of standardized exchange. Others have raised the possibility, without solid evidence, that the structure relates to calendar tracking or ritual use, pointing to its alignment and visibility from a distance as something more symbolic than practical. What makes Monte Sierpe difficult to pin down isn't a lack of attention. It's the absence of written records. The cultures capable of building something this large left no inscriptions explaining its purpose, no oral tradition that survived intact to clarify the builder's intent. Modern surveys using drones and multispectral imaging have only deepened the puzzle, revealing the segmented structure more clearly while still failing to explain why it exists at all. So the holes remain. Thousands of them, sunk into a hillside, facing an ocean that has watched over them for centuries. Were they granaries, ledgers, something tied to trade we no longer understand? Or were they built for a purpose that simply hasn't survived into the present at all? Standing at Monte Sierpe today, looking down the long perforated scar across the land, it's hard not to wonder what those who carved it were truly keeping count of. And what, if anything, they were trying to leave behind for someone, someday, to find. If Monte Sierpe poses a riddle of purpose, a structure whose function has slipped quietly out of memory, Our next destination poses something stranger still. A place where the land itself seems to have been reshaped by forces no one can fully account for. Deep in the Republic of Karelia, in northwestern Russia near the border with Finland, rises a mountain that locals have approached with caution for generations. Its name is Vottovaara, and even before you learn its history, something about it feels wrong. At first glance, Vottovaara doesn't look remarkable. It's a modest peak by mountain standards, reaching just under 417 meters, covered in dense taiga forest, surrounded by bogs and quiet lakes typical of Karelia's wilderness. But climate slopes, and the landscape begins to shift into something far more unsettling. Thousands of trees here grow twisted, bent, and contorted in ways that don't match typical patterns of wind damage or disease. Branches curl back on themselves. Trunks spiral as though wrung out by some unseen hand. Scientists have offered natural explanations: extreme exposure, soil composition, possibly fungal infection affecting growth patterns. But the sheer density and strangeness of the deformities have made Vottovaara a subject of fascination and unease for decades. And the trees are only the beginning. Scattered across the summit are roughly 1,600 to 1,800 standing stones, many balanced delicately on smaller rock supports. Formations known as sides in regional folklore, a term tied to ancient Sami spiritual practice. Some of these stones weigh several tons, yet rest on points so small and precise that their stability seems to defy ordinary expectation. Were they placed deliberately, balanced through some now-lost technique? Or are they the product of natural processes? Glacial deposition, perhaps? Or the slow work of erosion exploiting fractures in the bedrock? Geologists have proposed exactly that retreating glaciers, thousands of years ago, could have left boulders perched in unusual positions as the ice melted around them, a phenomenon documented in other parts of the world. It's a reasonable theory. It's also one that doesn't sit easily with everyone who has walked the summit, because alongside the stones are other features that resist such tidy explanation. Carved into the rock are flat, staircase-like formations, along with what some researchers have described as an altar-like structure. A stone seat, deliberately shaped, facing out toward the valley below. There's a depression nearby that locals have long called the place of sacrifice, with reddish mineral staining in the rock that some have linked to ritual use and others attribute simply to iron oxide deposits, a common and unremarkable occurrence in this kind of stone. Which explanation is correct may depend on who you ask, and how willing they are to leave a question unanswered. Vottovaara's documented human history only adds another layer. Archaeological surveys conducted from the 1990s onward, led primarily by Russian researcher Sergei Simonyan, identified what appeared to be the remains of ancient ceremonial sites, with some estimates suggesting human activity on the mountain dating back as far as 6,000 years. For the Sami people, an indigenous population with deep roots across northern Scandinavia and Karelia, mountains like Vottovaara held, and in some communities still hold, genuine spiritual significance, viewed as thresholds between the physical world and something beyond it. That context matters. It would be easy to treat the mountain's atmosphere as evidence of something supernatural, but it's worth remembering that sacred places don't require the paranormal to be meaningful. Sometimes a place becomes significant simply because generations of people have treated it that way. And yet the stories surrounding Vottovaara extend well beyond traditional reverence. Visitors and researchers over the years have reported a cluster of strange experiences: compasses spinning erratically near the summit, sudden disorientation despite familiar trails, an overwhelming and unexplained sense of dread that sets in without warning. Some hikers describe losing track of time entirely, only to realize hours had passed when it felt like minutes. Are these the effects of genuine geomagnetic anomalies? And there is some evidence of unusual magnetic readings in certain rock formations across Karelia. Or is this simply the psychological effect of an isolated, eerie landscape where expectation shapes perception long before logic gets a chance to weigh in? Neither possibility can be entirely dismissed, and neither has been definitively proven. What makes Vottovaara particularly difficult to categorize is that it resists a single narrative. It isn't purely a geological oddity, dismissible through erosion and twisted pine. It isn't purely a sacred indigenous site, explainable through cultural history alone. It isn't purely a magnetic anomaly, nor purely a place where suggestible minds see meaning in random shapes. It seems to sit at the intersection of all of these things: natural process, ancient belief, and unresolved physical anomaly, refusing to be filed neatly into any one box. Today, Vottovaara remains relatively remote, accessible mainly to those willing to make the long journey into Karelia's forested interior. It hasn't been swallowed by tourism, nor stripped of its strangeness by overexposure. The stones still sit balanced on their narrow points. The trees still grow in their impossible spirals, and the depression in the rock, whatever its true origin, still bears the same reddish stain it has carried for who knows how long. Perhaps the mountain holds no secret at all, only the slow, unremarkable work of ice, wind, and time, dressed up by isolation and folklore into something more dramatic than it really is. Or perhaps, somewhere in those twisted woods, there's a piece of the story that hasn't been told yet, geological, cultural, or otherwise, waiting for someone patient enough and willing enough to listen to what the mountain has to say. Vottovaara left us with a mountain that refuses easy categorization, natural process tangled with ancient belief, unresolved and unwilling to resolve. Our next stop trades granite and pine for open grassland, but the sense of unfinished history follows us there just the same. In the rolling highlands of Shankoang Province, in northern Laos, a landscape stretches out that looks, at first glance, almost peaceful. Rolling hills, scattered grasses, distant mountains soft with haze. But scattered across this terrain, thousands of them, across more than 90 separate sites, sit massive stone jars, some over 3 meters tall, carved from sandstone, granite, or limestone, weighing as much as several tons each. This is the plain of jars, and it has been quietly defying explanation for well over a century. The jars themselves are striking in their simplicity. Most are cylindrical, slightly tapered, with thick walls, and in many cases, a carved lip near the rim that suggests they once held lids. Though almost none of those lids survive today. A handful of stone discs found near certain sites are believed by some archaeologists to be the remnants of these covers, though whether they were purely functional or carried symbolic weight remains unclear. The jars vary considerably in size, from smaller vessels under a meter tall to massive monoliths that dwarf the people who walk among them. Some sites contain only a few dozen jars. The largest, known as Site 1, holds more than 300, clustered across a sweeping hillside that has become the most visited and most studied location on the plain. What makes the plain of jars immediately compelling isn't just the scale of the stones, but the sheer logistics behind them. These jars were carved from quarries located in many cases kilometers away from where they now stand. Moving stone vessels weighing several tons across uneven terrain without the wheel-based transport systems common in other ancient civilizations would have required significant manpower, planning, and almost certainly some form of organized society capable of directing that labor. And yet, when it comes to who actually built them, the historical record goes remarkably quiet. Local Lao legend offers one of the oldest explanations, though it leans more toward myth than mechanism. According to oral tradition, the jars were created by a legendary king named Kun Cheung, who, after winning a long and exhausting battle, ordered enormous vessels built to brew and store massive quantities of rice wine, a celebration on a scale matching the victory itself. It's a vivid story, the kind that travels well across generations precisely because it's so visual. Giant stone cups raised to a long-awaited peace. But charming as it is, there's little physical evidence to support a literal reading of the tale, and most researchers treat it as cultural folklore rather than a literal account of the jar's origin. The more widely accepted archaeological interpretation points towards something solemn rather than celebratory. Mortuary practice. Excavations conducted at several sites, including significant work led by French archaeologist Madeleine Colani in the 1930s, whose research remains foundational to nearly everything we know about the plain, uncovered human remains, burial goods, and ceramic fragments in and around many of the jars. This has led most archaeologists to conclude that the jars were likely used in some form of mortuary ritual, quite possibly involving secondary burial practices, where bodies were initially left to decompose, then later cremated or relocated, with remains eventually placed in or near the jars themselves. Beads, bronze and iron tools, ceramic vessels, and even glass ornaments have all been recovered from burial sites associated with the jars, suggesting a society with access to trade networks extending well beyond the immediate region. Radiocarbon dating and more recent research, including studies published in the 2010s and 2020s using luminescence dating techniques on the jars and surrounding burial sediment, have helped narrow the timeline considerably, suggesting the jars were likely created and used somewhere between 1240 BC and 660 AD, with the most concentrated period of activity falling roughly between 500 BC and 500 AD. That's a window spanning well over 1,000 years, raising its own quiet question. Was this a single culture maintaining a consistent practice across many centuries, or several distinct groups, perhaps connected through trade or shared ritual tradition, each contributing to the landscape over time? And this is where the mainstream explanation, while reasonably well supported, still leaves real gaps. If the jars were primarily mortuary in function, why are they positioned the way they are? Often on hilltops, in locations with sweeping, almost ceremonial views over the surrounding valleys. Burial practices in many ancient cultures do favor elevated visible terrain, often for spiritual or symbolic reasons tied to closeness with the sky or ancestral watchfulness. But the consistency of this placement across nearly 100 separate sites, stretched over such a vast area, raises a deeper question about coordination. Was there a shared belief system unifying these communities across the plain, something that dictated not just how the dead were treated, but precisely where? There's also the matter of who, exactly, the builders were. Unlike many ancient megalithic sites around the world, the Plain of Jars isn't tied to a single, clearly identified civilization with an established historical record. The people responsible for carving and placing these jars left no inscriptions, no written language that has been recovered, no clear lineage connecting them definitively to any modern ethnic group in Laos today. Researchers generally describe the jar builders simply as an Iron Age culture native to the region, but that description, while accurate, is also an acknowledgement of how much remains genuinely unknown. We can describe what tools they likely used. We can estimate when they were active. We still can't say with full confidence who they considered themselves to be, what they called this place, or what they believed happened to a person after the body was finally laid to rest among the stones. Then there's the unavoidable, more recent layer of history that complicates everything further: war. Xiangkhouang province was heavily bombed during the Vietnam War, particularly during the so-called Secret War conducted by the United States in Laos throughout the 1960s and 1970s. Unexploded ordnance still litters significant portions of the region today, and safe marked pathways through the Plain of Jars exist specifically because large areas surrounding the jar sites remain hazardous even now, decades later. This isn't an abstract historical footnote. It's a present, physical reality that has limited how thoroughly archaeologists have been able to excavate and survey the full extent of the plain. How many jars remain unexamined, sitting quietly in fields still considered too dangerous to fully study? How much of this mystery might be hiding not because it's been lost to time, but because it's been rendered, quite literally, untouchable by more recent conflict? It's worth sitting with that for a moment. Of the more than 90 known jar sites, only a fraction have been extensively excavated. Aerial surveys and updated mapping efforts, particularly those conducted in the 2000s and 2010s using LiDAR and satellite imaging, have continued to reveal additional jars and previously undocumented sites, suggesting that our understanding of the plain's true scale is still, even now, incomplete. Each new survey seems to add more questions rather than fewer. Beyond the academic debate, the Plain of Jars carries an atmosphere that visitors often describe as difficult to put into words. There's a stillness to the place, a kind of weighted quiet that seems to settle over the grassland despite its openness. Whether that feeling comes from genuine historical resonance, the accumulated presence of countless burials performed across more than 1,000 years, or simply from the psychological effect of standing among thousands of unexplained stone vessels in an isolated landscape, is, perhaps fittingly, not something that can be measured or proven either way. Some fringe theories have, predictably, attempted to fill in the gaps left by archaeology with more dramatic explanations. Claims involving lost advanced civilizations capable of feats of engineering beyond what's typically attributed to Iron Age societies, or speculation tying the jars to ritual practices far stranger than mortuary tradition. These ideas tend to circulate more in popular discussion than in academic literature, and it's worth being honest about that distinction. But even setting aside the more speculative claims, the documented, verified facts of the Plain of Jars remain strange enough on their own. A culture capable of quarrying, carving, and transporting multi-ton stone vessels across kilometers of difficult terrain, sustained over the better part of a millennium, leaving behind no written record of their own identity, no clear successor culture claiming direct descent, and no fully agreed-upon explanation for why hilltop placement mattered so much to their rituals. That's not a mystery that needs embellishment to remain compelling. Today, the Plain of Jars holds UNESCO World Heritage status, recognized in 2019, a designation that has brought both increased protection and increased attention to a site that spent much of the 20th century overshadowed by war and isolation. Tourism has grown steadily. Careful pathways now wind through the cleared sections of the most accessible sites, and ongoing archaeological work continues to chip away, slowly, at the unanswered questions the plain has held on to for so long. But chip away is really all that's happened so far. We know more than Madeleine Kalani did in the 1930s. We know considerably more than the colonial explorers who first documented the jars in written accounts during the late 19th century. And yet the central question, who were these people? What did they believe? And why did this particular landscape scattered across these specific hilltops hold such significance to them, remains in large part unanswered. Standing among the jars at Site 1, looking out over the grass-covered hills toward the distant mountains, it's difficult not to wonder what's still buried beneath the ground that hasn't yet been deemed safe enough to dig. How many more jars are out there, sitting quietly in unexamined fields, holding remains and artifacts that might finally answer the questions that have lingered here for over 1,000 years? Or is it possible that even full excavation, even complete safety, wouldn't be enough? That some part of what these jars meant to the people who made them simply didn't survive, lost not to danger or neglect, but to the quiet, inevitable erosion of memory across centuries with no one left to carry the story forward. The Plain of Jars left us with a landscape shaped by ritual, war, and memory, half erased by time. Our next site carries a different kind of isolation, not buried beneath grassland, but stranded entirely on its own island, in waters so remote that for centuries it simply slipped from view. In the high steppes of southern Siberia, within the Republic of Tuva, near the border where Russia meets Mongolia, lies a lake called Terekol. And in the middle of that lake, on a small island accessible only by boat or, in winter, by walking across frozen ice, sit the ruins of a structure so precisely built and so utterly mysterious in purpose that researchers have spent more than 2 centuries arguing over what it actually was. It's called Por-Bazhyn, which translates roughly to clay house in the Tuvan language, though that humble name does little to capture the scale of what remains. The structure forms a rectangular complex, oriented carefully along a north-south axis, measuring roughly 200 men by 161 meters, enclosed by walls that, in some sections, still rise several meters high, even after more than 1,000 years of exposure to one of the harshest climates on Earth. Inside the outer walls, archaeologists have identified the remains of what appears to be an inner citadel, along with the foundations of more than 30 separate buildings, courtyards, and what may have been residential quarters, arranged with a kind of deliberate, almost palatial symmetry. That symmetry is part of what makes Por-Bazhyn so difficult to dismiss as a simple ruin. This wasn't built carelessly. Whoever constructed it clearly had resources, planning, and architectural ambition far beyond what the region's later, more nomadic populations would have typically required. Yet there it sits, isolated on an island in a lake that, for much of the year, is locked beneath ice in a region where winter temperatures regularly plunge to -40 degrees Celsius, in one of the most remote and sparsely populated corners of Asia. Why would anyone choose this exact location, a place so disconnected, so difficult to reach, so exposed to extreme cold, to build something this elaborate? The earliest serious documentation of Por-Bazhyn came from Russian and European explorers in the 18th and 19th centuries, who noted the strange island ruins but had little ability, given the era's limited transportation and excavation methods, to investigate further. It wasn't until the 20th century, and more significantly the early 2000s, that substantial archaeological work began in earnest. A major Russian-led excavation effort launched in 2007, backed by considerable government and academic interest, brought modern dating techniques, satellite mapping, and a dedicated research team to the site for the first time, determined to finally answer the question that had lingered for generations. Who built this, and why here? Radiocarbon dating and architectural analysis eventually placed the construction of Por-Bazhyn in the 8th century AD, tying it to the Uyghur Khaganate, a powerful nomadic empire that controlled large portions of Central Asia during that period. This timeline lines up reasonably well with broader regional history. The Uyghur Khaganate was known for ambitious building projects, and the structure's layout bears some resemblance to Chinese Tang dynasty architectural influences, likely absorbed through trade and political contact along nearby branches of the Silk Road. On the surface, this gives Por-Bazhyn a relatively tidy origin story. A powerful empire, flexing its resources and architectural sophistication, choosing to build a fortress, palace, or administrative complex out in the steppe. Except the location keeps refusing to cooperate with that explanation. If Por-Bazhyn were intended primarily as a military fortress, its placement raises immediate strategic concerns. The island offers natural isolation, certainly, but it also offers profound inconvenience. Difficult to supply, difficult to reinforce quickly, difficult to use as a base for projecting power over surrounding territory the way a more accessible fortress would. Military structures, even ancient ones, tend to prioritize accessibility for supply lines and rapid troop movement. Por-Bazhyn, sitting in the middle of a lake in one of the most isolated basins in Siberia, seems almost deliberately positioned to avoid that kind of practical military function. So if not a fortress, then what? One of the leading alternative theories suggests Por-Bazhyn may have served a religious or spiritual purpose, possibly connected to Manichaeism, a religion that gained significant influence within the Uyghur Khaganate during the 8th century, after the Uyghur ruling elite formally adopted it as a state religion. Manichaean architecture elsewhere in Central Asia has occasionally favored isolated, symbolically significant locations for temples and monastic complexes, and the deliberate seclusion of Por-Bazhyn would align reasonably well with that kind of spiritual retreat, a place set apart from ordinary life, built specifically to be difficult to reach, perhaps intentionally distanced from secular settlement and military concern. There's something quietly compelling about that theory, because it reframes the site's most confusing feature, its impractical isolation, as potentially its entire point. A fortress in a place like this seems like a poor decision. A temple, a monastery, a place meant for contemplation and ritual distance from the world, makes considerably more sense in that same impossible location. But even this explanation comes with its own unresolved gaps. If Por-Bazhyn was primarily religious in function, why does its layout include features more typically associated with administrative or residential complexes? Multiple structures, courtyards, what may have been separate living quarters for distinct groups of people. Was this a monastery housing a significant religious community? a combined religious and administrative center, perhaps tied to a ruler who wanted both spiritual legitimacy and physical distance from the pressures of governing an empire. Or something else entirely, a function we haven't yet correctly identified because we're still trying to force the evidence into categories. Fortress, temple, palace, that may not fully describe what this place actually was. The 2007 excavation, while extensive, didn't produce a definitive answer. Researchers uncovered roof tiles, wooden support beams remarkably well preserved by the site's cold, waterlogged conditions, and architectural elements suggesting Chinese-influenced construction techniques, but they found surprisingly little in the way of artifacts that would typically clarify daily use, limited evidence of large-scale habitation, limited household items, limited indication of the kind of long-term, lived-in domestic activity you'd expect from a permanently occupied fortress or palace. This absence is its own kind of clue. It suggests Por-Bazhyn may not have been continuously inhabited for an extended period, but rather used briefly, perhaps ceremonially, before being abandoned. Some researchers have proposed the entire complex may never have been fully completed or fully utilized at all, possibly abandoned not long after construction due to the collapse of the Uyghur Khaganate itself, which fractured under internal and external pressure later in the 9th century. That raises a particularly haunting possibility. What if Por-Bazhyn represents an ambition that simply ran out of time? A structure conceived with enormous resources and architectural intention, situated in a location chosen for reasons we may never fully reconstruct, only to be left unfinished or barely used before the empire responsible for it began to unravel. If that's the case, the island isn't holding the secret of how it was used. It's holding the secret of what it was supposed to become before history intervened and the project, whatever its true purpose, was abandoned to the lake and the steppe wind. There's also a more recent and unexpected element to the Por-Bazhyn story that adds further complexity rather than resolving it. Geological surveys conducted during the 2007 excavation revealed that the lake itself, Terra-Col, may have been considerably lower, or even partially dry, at the time the structure was originally built, meaning the island we see today may not have been an island at all when construction began. If that's accurate, it fundamentally changes the calculus of the site's original isolation. A structure built on relatively accessible land, only to become stranded on an island generations later as water levels rose, tells a very different story than a structure deliberately built in the middle of a lake specifically for its remoteness. Which version is correct likely shapes everything else we think we understand about why this place was built and what it meant to the people who built it. And as of now, the geological and archaeological evidence on this point remains genuinely unsettled. It's worth pausing on just how isolated Por-Bazhyn remains even today. Tuva itself is one of the least visited regions in Russia, bordered by remote stretches of Mongolia, accessible mainly through long overland travel rather than convenient infrastructure. Terra-Col Lake sits within this already secluded landscape, and the ruins themselves receive only a small number of researchers and visitors each year, limited further by the practical difficulty of reaching the island and the short windows of the year when conditions make sustained excavation feasible at all. This isn't a site that's been picked apart by decades of casual tourism or repeated archaeological digs. In many ways, Por-Bazhyn has barely begun to be studied, relative to how long it has existed. Local Tuvan folklore offers its own layer of meaning, separate from formal archaeology. Some oral traditions describe the island ruins as connected to a powerful, possibly tyrannical ruler, with stories suggesting tragedy or punishment tied to the site's abandonment. Though, as with much oral history surrounding ancient ruins, it's difficult to determine how much of this reflects genuine historical memory passed down across many generations, and how much developed later as a way to explain a structure whose original purpose had already been forgotten by the time these stories took shape. What remains, after more than 2 centuries of curiosity and over a decade of serious modern excavation, is a structure we can describe in remarkable architectural detail, built by a civilization we can name with reasonable confidence, during a period we can date with real precision, and yet whose fundamental purpose still resists full agreement. Fortress, temple, monastery, unfinished ambition, abandoned before it ever truly served its purpose. Each theory carries genuine supporting evidence. None of them fully closes the case. Standing on that island today, surrounded by the crumbling outlines of walls that once rose with clear architectural confidence, looking out across a lake that may not have even existed in its current form when the first stones were laid, it's difficult not to wonder what Por-Bazhyn was truly meant to be. Was this a place built for power, for faith, or for something that blended the two so completely that modern categories simply fail to capture it? And if the lake itself has changed since construction began, what else about this place, its purpose, its builders, its final abandonment, might still be waiting, quietly, beneath water, ice, and more than 1,000 years of silence, for someone to finally understand it correctly? Por-Bazhyn left us with a structure whose purpose seems to dissolve the closer we look at it. Fortress, temple, or unfinished ambition, depending on which clue you weigh most heavily. Our next site offers no such sprawling complex, no lake-bound isolation, no commanding walls visible from a distance. Instead, it hides beneath an ordinary market town in the English county of Hertfordshire, accessible by nothing more than a narrow shaft cut straight down into the chalk beneath a busy crossroads. This is Royston Cave, and its discovery, its carvings, and its purpose remain, even after nearly 3 centuries of study, frustratingly unresolved. The cave was found almost by accident in August 1742, when workmen laying foundations for a new bench near the market cross in Royston struck something unexpected beneath the surface. A millstone, set flush into the ground, concealing a vertical shaft descending into the chalk bedrock below. Curiosity, predictably, won out over caution. A boy was lowered down to investigate, and what he found waiting at the bottom was a roughly bell-shaped chamber, carved by hand directly into the soft chalk, rising about 8 meters in height, with a diameter of roughly 5 meters at its widest point near the base. The cave wasn't a natural formation. Someone had deliberately excavated this space, shaping it with clear intention, and then, at some point, sealed it away entirely, leaving no record, no map, no written account explaining who had done it or why. What greeted those early explorers in 1742 wasn't an empty hollow. The walls of the cave were covered, almost floor to ceiling in places, with an extraordinary collection of carved figures, symbols, and niches, a dense, layered tapestry of religious and symbolic imagery that researchers are still working to fully interpret today. There are depictions that appear to reference the crucifixion, a carving believed to represent St. Catherine, complete with her traditional wheel, figures that may represent the Holy Family, and what some researchers identify as Sheila, Ngig-style imagery, a category of figurative carving found elsewhere in medieval Britain and Ireland, whose symbolic meaning remains debated even in contexts outside Royston entirely. There are also carved niches positioned around the chamber, along with a series of holes drilled into the walls in patterns that some have suggested once held wooden or metal fittings, though their original purpose has never been definitively established. This blend of religious imagery has led most researchers toward the most widely accepted explanation: that Royston Cave served at some point as a chapel or shrine associated with the Knights Templar. The dating logic behind this connects to genuine historical context. Royston itself sits directly at the intersection of 2 ancient roads, the Icknield Way and the Ermine Street, a crossroads location historically significant enough that it gave the town its name, and one that placed it along established medieval travel and pilgrimage routes. Templar associations with crossroads sites weren't unusual. The order maintained properties and chapels across England during the height of their influence in the 12th and 13th centuries, often positioned along the very routes that pilgrims and travelers depended on. Some of the cave's carvings have been interpreted as bearing stylistic similarities to other confirmed Templar sites elsewhere in Europe, lending the theory additional, if circumstantial, support. But here's where the certainty starts to soften. The Knights Templar were formally suppressed in 1307, their order dissolved under intense political and religious pressure, with many of their English properties seized by the crown shortly afterward. If the cave does date to this period or earlier, it raises an immediate question. Why would such an elaborately decorated chapel, presumably significant enough to warrant this kind of labor and craftsmanship, be deliberately sealed and effectively erased from local memory so thoroughly that by the 18th century, no one in the town had any surviving record of its existence at all? Suppression of the Templars was certainly dramatic and disruptive, but it typically involved seizure and repurposing of properties, not the wholesale physical burial of entire chambers beneath town squares. Something about the totality of Royston Cave's concealment doesn't quite match the historical pattern we'd expect, even from a genuinely Templar-associated site caught up in the Order's downfall. Other researchers have proposed alternative or overlapping timelines and uses. Some suggest the cave may have functioned as a hermitage, a secluded space for a single religious recluse seeking isolation for prayer and contemplation, a documented practice in medieval England that occasionally did involve hand-carved underground chambers. Under this theory, the religious carvings reflect personal devotion rather than institutional Templar activity, and the cave's eventual sealing might simply reflect the death of its occupant and the slow erosion of local memory over subsequent generations, rather than any deliberate suppression. It's a quieter, less dramatic explanation, but it carries its own internal logic, and it doesn't require explaining away the inconsistencies in the Templar timeline. Still, others have pointed to evidence suggesting the cave may have seen use, or at least modification, across multiple distinct periods, rather than being carved entirely in one continuous effort. Some of the carvings appear stylistically inconsistent with one another, suggesting different hands, different eras, and potentially different purposes layered on top of each other over time. Perhaps beginning as something else entirely before later religious use, or beginning as a religious space that was later modified or added to by subsequent occupants with different intentions. If that's accurate, then asking who built Royston Cave may be the wrong question altogether. The more accurate question might be, how many different groups, across how many different centuries, contributed to what we see today, and how much of the original purpose has been buried beneath later additions we're struggling to separate from the earliest layer of construction. The carvings themselves resist easy categorization, too. Beyond the recognizably Christian imagery, there are figures and symbols that don't fit neatly into standard medieval religious iconography found elsewhere in England, leading some researchers to wonder whether the cave reflects a blending of mainstream religious practice with something more localized, more idiosyncratic, perhaps shaped by whatever specific individual or small community used the space, rather than following a standardized template we'd recognize from larger, more conventional churches and chapels of the period. This raises an uncomfortable possibility for anyone hoping for a clean answer, that the cave's purpose may have been deeply personal or specific to a particular group whose beliefs and practices simply weren't documented anywhere else, meaning we may be looking at the only surviving physical record of something that otherwise left no trace in written history at all. There's also the question of why the entrance was concealed so effectively, with a millstone fitted precisely over the shaft, hidden beneath what later became an ordinary market crossroads. Was this deliberate suppression, an attempt by someone at some point to erase the cave's existence entirely, perhaps tied to the same pressures that dissolved the Templars, or perhaps to entirely separate religious or political tensions during England's long history of shifting religious allegiance through the Reformation and beyond? Or was the sealing simply practical, a structurally necessary measure to protect a crumbling, no longer used chamber from collapse, with no deeper motive beyond basic safety? The millstone itself offers no inscription, no date, nothing beyond its physical presence to indicate when it was placed or by whom. Modern investigations have continued chipping away at these questions without fully resolving them. The cave is now open to the public, managed and preserved by a local trust, with guided visits allowing people to descend the same shaft those 18th century workmen first uncovered and view the carvings firsthand. Conservation efforts have focused on stabilizing the chalk walls and protecting the carvings from further deterioration, while researchers continue to debate dating methods, since chalk itself doesn't lend itself easily to the kind of radiocarbon dating techniques used at sites like Por-Bazhyn or the Plain of Jars. Without organic material to test directly, dating Royston Cave relies heavily on stylistic analysis of the carvings themselves, comparison with other documented medieval religious sites, and historical context drawn from the town's broader history, methods that provide reasonable estimates but fall well short of definitive certainty. What makes Royston Cave particularly compelling and particularly frustrating is how much physical evidence survives directly in front of us, while the interpretive context surrounding that evidence remains so persistently unsettled. This isn't a site where erosion or war has stripped away most of the original material, the way conflict and unexploded ordnance have limited access across portions of the Plain of Jars, or where geological uncertainty complicates an otherwise architecturally clear structure, as with Por-Bazhyn's possibly shifting lake. At Royston, the carvings are simply there, remarkably well preserved, dense with symbolic detail, waiting to be correctly read. And yet, after nearly 3 centuries of scholarly attention, no single interpretation has managed to account for every detail without leaving some piece of the puzzle stubbornly unexplained. Perhaps that's the most unsettling part of all. Royston Cave isn't hidden in some remote wilderness, isolated by geography or climate the way Vottovaara or Por-Bazhyn are. It sits beneath an active town center, a short walk from shops and homes, surrounded by people going about ordinary daily life entirely unaware of the strange, symbol-covered chamber resting in the chalk just beneath their feet. How long did this place sit forgotten before that millstone was finally disturbed in 1742? What knowledge? What specific beliefs? What individual or community's entire spiritual world existed down there, fully formed and meaningful to whoever carved it, only to be sealed away so completely that even the town built directly above it lost all memory of its existence? Standing at the base of that chalk chamber today, surrounded by carved saints, mysterious niches, and symbols that still resist confident translation, it's difficult not to wonder whether the answer was ever meant to survive at all. Was Royston Cave a Templar chapel, a hermit's quiet sanctuary, or something else entirely, built and modified by hands and beliefs we have no other record of? And if the chalk walls themselves hold no further secrets to give up through modern science, is it possible that the true purpose of this place was deliberately meant to disappear, leaving only the carvings behind, speaking in a language we can see clearly but perhaps never fully understand? Royston Cave left us with carvings that speak clearly, but won't quite translate. A chamber of certainty and confusion sitting side by side beneath an English market town. Our next mystery trades stone walls and chalk chambers for something far less tangible. Shapes so vast they can't be properly seen from the ground at all, etched into the earth itself across one of the most remote and inhospitable landscapes on the planet. Welcome to the steppe and desert basins surrounding Barsa-Kelmes, in the Kazakh interior, where enormous geometric figures, mounds and lines have been quietly waiting in the dirt for what may be thousands of years, largely unnoticed by anyone outside the region until satellite imagery finally gave researchers a vantage point capable of seeing them properly. Barsa-Kelmes itself carries an unsettling name before you even get to the geoglyphs. In Kazakh, it translates roughly to, "If you go, you won't return," a name historically applied both to a now largely desiccated island in the shrinking Aral Sea and, more broadly, to surrounding stretches of the Kazakh steppe, known for their harsh, disorienting terrain. This is a landscape that has swallowed travelers before, a flat, often featureless expanse where distances deceive and landmarks are scarce. It's a fitting, if eerie, backdrop for structures that, for most of human history, existed entirely beyond the perceptual reach of the people walking directly across them. The geoglyphs themselves first came to wider attention in 2007, when a Kazakh economist named Dmitry Day, examining satellite imagery of the region, reportedly while researching unrelated archaeological or geographic features, noticed a series of strange, precise shapes embedded in the landscape that simply didn't belong. Squares, crosses, rings, and one particularly striking swastika-like formation, oriented with apparent intentionality, all formed not through painted or carved markings, but through earthen mounds and ridges, raised and arranged across the steppe in patterns clearly too large and too geometrically consistent to be the product of natural erosion or geological accident. Further investigation, both from satellite analysis and subsequent ground surveys, eventually identified more than 50, and by some counts upward of 260, separate geoglyph formations scattered across the Turgai region of northern Kazakhstan, an area that includes but extends well beyond the immediate vicinity of Barsa-Kelmes itself. The scale of these formations is part of what makes them so difficult to fully appreciate from the ground. The largest known figure, often referred to as the Ushtugai Square, spans roughly 287 meters across, constructed from 101 separate earthen mounds arranged with careful, deliberate spacing to form a precise geometric outline. Other formations take the shape of rings, crosses, and more complex compound figures, some stretching even larger than the Ushtugai Square. From eye level, walking across the steppe, these shapes are essentially invisible, just subtle, low rises in otherwise flat terrain, barely distinguishable as anything other than natural undulation in the soil. It's only from significant height, whether from satellite imagery or aerial photography, that the underlying geometry resolves into something unmistakably deliberate. This raises the most immediate and perhaps unavoidable question. If these shapes can only be properly appreciated from the air, why were they built at all? Who were they meant for, in a world without satellites, without aircraft, without any obvious means of viewing your own work from a height sufficient to recognize it as more than scattered mounds of dirt? Archaeological dating of the Turgai geoglyphs has proven genuinely difficult, in large part because earthen structures of this kind don't preserve organic material as readily or as reliably as stone structures or buried artifacts might. Early estimates, based on comparative analysis with other archaeological remains found in the surrounding region, suggested the geoglyphs could date back roughly 8,000 years, potentially placing their construction in the Neolithic period, long before most recognized monumental architecture elsewhere in the ancient world. Some researchers have proposed more conservative estimates, suggesting certain formations may date instead to the Bronze Age, roughly within the range of 2000 to 1000 BC, still remarkably old, but considerably more recent than the earliest proposed timeline. The honest answer is that dating remains unsettled, with different formations potentially representing different periods of construction altogether, rather than a single unified building campaign carried out by one culture at one moment in time. The leading mainstream theory ties the geoglyphs to ancient pastoral and semi-nomadic populations who inhabited the Central Asian steppe during the relevant periods. Communities whose subsistence depended heavily on livestock herding across vast, open grassland. Under this interpretation, the mounds composing each geoglyph may have originated as the remains of structures used in daily or seasonal life, possibly platforms, enclosures, or ritual gathering points, that were deliberately built up over generations into the larger geometric patterns we now observe from above. Some researchers have suggested the shapes may have held ceremonial or astronomical significance, potentially tied to solstice tracking or seasonal markers relevant to a pastoral society whose survival depended heavily on understanding and predicting environmental cycles across the steppe. This explanation carries genuine logical appeal. Ancient cultures across the world have demonstrated sophisticated astronomical awareness without modern technology, often encoding solar or lunar alignments into structures built entirely from materials and methods available to them locally. If the Turgai geoglyphs function similarly as large-scale calendrical or ceremonial markers, their geometric precision wouldn't necessarily require aerial viewing to serve their intended purpose. A society capable of measuring and tracking these shapes from the ground, using surveying techniques we may not yet fully understand, could have built structures whose overall geometry mattered more for ritual or symbolic completeness than for any practical visual appreciation from above. In other words, perhaps these shapes were never meant to be seen as shapes at all, not by the builders themselves. Perhaps the act of constructing them, mound by mound, generation by generation, carried the actual significance, while the resulting aerial geometry is simply an unintended, almost incidental byproduct of a process whose true purpose was something else entirely. astronomical calculation, ritual procession, territorial marking, or seasonal gathering points whose meaning never depended on a bird's-eye view at all. And yet, that explanation, however reasonable, doesn't fully satisfy everyone studying these formations, in part because of just how geometrically precise several of the larger geoglyphs appear to be. The Ushtogai square, for instance, displays a level of symmetry and proportional consistency that some researchers argue would be genuinely difficult to achieve purely through incremental generational construction without some form of overarching design plan, measured and laid out with intention from the very beginning, rather than accumulated gradually and somewhat organically over time. If that's accurate, it suggests the builders possessed surveying knowledge, or at least localized measurement techniques, sophisticated enough to plan and execute large-scale geometric design across open, featureless terrain, without any apparent need to verify their work from height. That's not necessarily implausible. Ancient societies elsewhere have demonstrated comparable surveying sophistication using simple tools, sightlines, and accumulated practical knowledge passed down through specialized roles within their communities. But it does raise the bar on what we're willing to assume about the technical capability of the relatively obscure cultures believed to have inhabited this specific region during the proposed construction periods. Cultures about whom comparatively little detailed historical or archaeological information survives, especially compared to better documented ancient civilizations elsewhere in Asia, Europe, or the Americas. There's also the broader regional context worth considering, because the Turgai geoglyphs don't exist in complete isolation from other unusual large-scale earthworks found elsewhere in Central Asia and the surrounding steppe regions. Other countries within the former Soviet sphere, including formations identified in parts of Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Russia's southern steppe regions, have occasionally revealed similar large-scale geometric earthworks, suggesting that whatever cultural practice or motivation drove the construction of the Turgai geoglyphs may not have been entirely unique to this one specific area, but rather part of a broader, more widespread tradition across Central Asia, whose full extent and underlying purpose researchers are still working to properly map and understand. The swastika-shaped formation among the Turgai geoglyphs deserves particular attention, if only because the symbol carries such loaded modern associations that it's easy to forget the shape itself predates those associations by thousands of years across numerous, entirely unrelated ancient cultures. The swastika, in its more ancient and original context, appears across multiple historical civilizations as a solar or cyclical symbol, often associated with movement, the sun, or continuity. Long before its 20th century appropriation gave it an entirely different and deeply troubling cultural meaning in parts of the world. Its appearance among the Turgai formations likely reflects this older, broader symbolic tradition, potentially tied to solar symbolism consistent with the astronomical and seasonal tracking theories proposed for the geoglyphs more generally, rather than carrying any of the associations the symbol would later, and separately, acquire. Beyond the central debate over astronomical versus ceremonial versus territorial function, more speculative theories have predictably found their way into popular discussion surrounding the Turgai geoglyphs, particularly given how dramatically the only visible from above framing tends to capture public imagination. Some have drawn comparisons to other famous geoglyph sites around the world, most notably the Nazca lines in Peru, suggesting a kind of shared ancient tradition of large-scale earth art whose purpose transcended practical function entirely, serving instead some symbolic or spiritual relationship between the builders and the sky itself, regardless of whether that relationship required literal aerial viewing to hold meaning. Others, working further from mainstream academic consensus, have proposed more speculative ideas involving ancient long-distance trade or communication networks, suggesting the geoglyphs might have functioned as massive territorial markers or wayfinding signals intended to be read by travelers approaching from specific directions or elevated vantage points like nearby hills, rather than requiring true aerial perspective at all. It's worth noting that none of these more speculative interpretations currently carries the kind of supporting archaeological evidence that the pastoral ceremonial theory does, but the fundamental, unresolved strangeness of the geoglyphs. Their scale, their geometric precision, their apparent disconnect from any obvious ground-level viewing audience continues to leave room for these alternative readings to feel, at minimum, difficult to entirely dismiss. Ground-based archaeological investigation of the Turgai geoglyphs has remained genuinely limited compared to many other sites explored throughout this examination, due in significant part to the sheer remoteness and difficulty of the terrain itself. The Kazakh steppe surrounding Barsa-Kelmes and the broader Turgai region is sparsely populated, with limited infrastructure connecting many of the geoglyph sites to easily accessible roads or research facilities. Excavation efforts conducted by Kazakh archaeologists in the years following the 2007 discovery have focused on a relatively small subset of the identified formations, recovering some pottery fragments and limited material evidence suggestive of ancient human activity in the immediate vicinity, but nothing approaching the comprehensive, detailed dating and contextual analysis that more accessible and heavily studied sites elsewhere have received. This means our understanding of the Turgai geoglyphs remains, in a very real sense, still in its early stages, more than 15 years after their initial rediscovery via satellite imagery. That word, rediscovery, carries its own quiet weight here. These shapes weren't unknown to history in the way some other entries in this exploration suggest deliberate concealment or forgotten purpose. They simply existed, visible only from a perspective no one possessed access to until the relatively recent advent of satellite mapping technology made it possible to look down at the steppe and recognize, almost by accident, that the patterns scattered across this remote stretch of Kazakhstan weren't random at all. How many other geoglyphs, across how many other remote, sparsely surveyed regions of the world, might still be waiting for exactly that same kind of accidental aerial discovery? The Turgai formations weren't found because someone went looking for ancient earthworks specifically. They were found because someone happened to be looking at the right satellite images for an entirely different reason and noticed something in the landscape that didn't belong. This raises an uncomfortable but genuinely important question about how much of our current archaeological knowledge depends not just on careful, deliberate research, but on the sheer luck of who happens to be looking where, with what tools, at what particular moment. Before 2007, the Ushtagai Square and its surrounding formations existed exactly as they do now, unchanged, fully formed, completely real, and yet entirely unknown to modern archaeology, hidden in plain sight not through deliberate concealment, but simply through inaccessibility of perspective. That's a genuinely different category of mystery than many of the sites we've examined so far. This isn't a structure deliberately sealed away, like Royston Cave beneath its market town, or a site rendered inaccessible by modern conflict, like portions of the Plain of Jars. This is a mystery that existed in complete, undisturbed visibility for thousands of years, waiting not to be uncovered, but simply to be seen properly for the first time. It's worth considering, too, what this implies about the people who built these shapes in the first place. If the prevailing ceremonial and astronomical theories hold, these were communities deeply engaged with tracking celestial and seasonal cycles, encoding that knowledge into the very landscape they inhabited through methods that, even without aerial confirmation, clearly required sophisticated planning, sustained community effort across what may have been multiple generations, and a shared cultural commitment to maintaining and expanding these formations over extended periods of time. That's not a passing curiosity or a single, isolated ritual act. That's evidence of an organized, persistent cultural practice, carried out by people whose names, languages, and specific beliefs have been almost entirely lost to time, leaving behind only the shapes themselves as physical testament to whatever drove them to invest this much sustained effort into structures whose full significance, even to the builders, may have depended on a perspective none of them could have personally experienced. Or perhaps that assumption itself deserves more scrutiny than it usually receives. Perhaps the builders never needed or wanted an aerial view at all, and our modern fascination with how these shapes look from above says more about our own perspective and expectations than it does about the actual intentions behind their construction. We tend to assume, almost reflexively, that anything resembling intentional geometric design must have been meant to be seen and appreciated as a complete visual whole. But ground-level rituals, processions, and ceremonial activities don't necessarily require that kind of comprehensive overview to hold deep meaning for the people directly participating in them. Walking a specific path along the outline of a massive earthen square, mound by mound, across the open steppe, might have carried profound ceremonial significance entirely independent of whether anyone involved ever conceived of or cared about what that path looked like from a height none of them would ever actually reach. Today, the geoglyphs of the Turgai region remain under continued study, with Kazakh researchers and international collaborators gradually expanding both satellite analysis and limited ground survey work in an effort to better understand the full scope, age, and purpose of these formations. Additional geoglyphs continue to be identified through ongoing satellite review, suggesting the true total number of formations across this stretch of Central Asian steppe may still be incompletely catalogued, even now. The remoteness that originally hid these shapes from view for thousands of years continues, in a different way, to slow our efforts to fully understand them, even with the advantage of modern technology revealing their existence in the first place. Standing, hypothetically, at ground level somewhere along the outline of the Ushtugai Square, surrounded by nothing but flat, wind-swept steppe stretching toward a horizon, broken only by faint, barely perceptible rises in the earth, it would be almost impossible to recognize you were standing inside one of the most geometrically precise ancient earthworks ever documented in Central Asia. The shape only resolves into meaning from a perspective entirely unavailable to the people who built it, walked across it, and presumably understood in ways we may never fully reconstruct exactly why this specific location, this specific configuration, mattered enough to commit to building it at all. Was this knowledge meant to be discovered eventually, by someone, someday, capable of finally seeing what the builders themselves never could? Or is that idea simply a comforting modern narrative, imposed retroactively onto people whose actual reasons for raising these mounds had nothing to do with future eyes, future satellites, or future curiosity at all? People who built something vast and lasting for reasons entirely their own, never imagining and never needing that anyone would one day look down from the sky and finally understand what they had made. The Turgai geoglyphs left us staring at shapes built for a perspective their makers may never have possessed, a mystery of intention as much as construction. Our next site brings us back down to eye level, to a wind-swept clifftop on the southern coast of Sweden, where 59 massive boulders form the unmistakable outline of a ship, frozen in stone, facing out toward the Baltic Sea. This is Alais Stenar, sometimes called Alais Stones, and despite sitting in plain view above the fishing village of Kosaberga for what may be well over 1,000 years, it remains one of Scandinavia's most quietly contested archaeological puzzles. The setting alone earns attention before you even consider the stones themselves. Alais Stenar sits atop a ridge near the southern tip of Sweden, in Scania, elevated enough to command a sweeping view across the surrounding farmland and out toward the open water of the Baltic. The 59 boulders, most weighing between 1.5 and 1.8 tons, with the largest exceeding that range considerably, are arranged not in a circle or scattered cluster, but in a deliberate, elongated outline measuring roughly 67 meters in length and about 19 meters at its widest point, a shape that, when viewed from above or even from certain angles at ground level, reads unmistakably as the silhouette of a ship, complete with distinctly pointed stem and stern stones marking each end, rising taller than the boulders forming the sides. That ship-like form is, in many ways, the entire crux of the mystery. Stone settings arranged in ship shapes aren't unique to this single site. They appear elsewhere across Scandinavia, particularly in connection with burial practices during the late Iron Age and early Viking period, where stones arranged in a ship's outline often mark the grave of someone of status, a symbolic vessel meant to carry the dead into whatever afterlife the surrounding culture believed awaited them. Given this established regional tradition, the most straightforward mainstream interpretation of Alais Stenar positions it as a particularly large and elaborate example of exactly this kind of ship-setting burial monument, likely constructed sometime around 600 AD, placing it firmly within the Late Iron Age, several centuries before the more widely recognized Viking Age that followed. Radiocarbon dating conducted on organic material recovered from the site, including charcoal and bone fragments found during excavations carried out in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, has generally supported this dating window, with most evidence clustering around the 6th or 7th century AD. Excavations have also recovered cremated human remains from within the stone formation, lending direct physical support to the burial theory and suggesting the site likely did serve, at least in part, as a grave or memorial marker for someone whose identity has been lost entirely to time, along with the specific rank, family, or community they may have represented. On its surface, this gives Stenar a relatively coherent origin story, one consistent with broader, well-documented Scandinavian burial practices of the period. And yet, much like several sites we've already explored, the details surrounding this explanation refuse to settle into complete agreement, beginning with a question that has occupied Swedish archaeologists and astronomers alike for decades. Is the ship shape the primary, intended purpose of this monument? Or is it something closer to an elaborate visual byproduct of a structure actually designed around an entirely different function? The astronomical theory surrounding Stenar gained significant traction in the late 20th century, driven largely by the work of Swedish researcher Bob G. Lind, who proposed, after extensive observation and measurement at the site, that the stone setting functions as a kind of massive solar calendar. According to this theory, certain stones within the formation align precisely with the position of the sun on the horizon during the summer and winter solstices, as well as the spring and autumn equinoxes, suggesting the monument's builders possess detailed astronomical knowledge and deliberately incorporated it into the stone's exact placement, potentially allowing the site to function as a method of tracking the agricultural calendar, seasonal cycles, or ceremonially significant dates throughout the year. This isn't an inherently implausible claim. Solar and astronomical alignment in ancient monumental architecture is well documented across numerous cultures and time periods, from Stonehenge in England to various megalithic sites across Europe, suggesting that sophisticated naked-eye astronomical observation, sustained across generations of careful tracking, was well within the capability of pre-modern societies who depended heavily on understanding seasonal change for agricultural and survival purposes. If Stenar does incorporate genuine solar alignment, it would place the monument within this broader, well-established tradition of combining practical astronomical function with symbolic or ceremonial monument building, much like some of the theories proposed for the geoglyphs of the Turgai region, or the alignment patterns suspected at other ancient sites around the world. But the astronomical interpretation hasn't gone unchallenged, and the disagreement among researchers here is worth sitting with rather than glossing over. Critics of the solar calendar theory point out that with 59 individual stones arranged across a 67-meter span, the statistical likelihood of finding some stones that appear to align with solstice or equinox sunrise and sunset positions, purely by coincidence, isn't negligible. Skeptical archaeologists and astronomers have argued that without clear, deliberate markers indicating intentional alignment, distinguishing genuine ancient astronomical design from a kind of after-the-fact pattern recognition becomes extremely difficult, particularly at a site where the primary, better-supported archaeological evidence points toward a fundamentally different purpose: burial and memorial. This tension between the burial theory and the astronomical theory hasn't been definitively resolved, and it's entirely possible that resolution, in the sense of a single, universally agreed answer, may simply not be achievable given the evidence currently available. It's also worth considering that these two explanations aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. A ship-setting grave marker, built with genuine reverence and significant communal effort for someone of considerable status, could plausibly have also been constructed with conscious attention to solar positioning, particularly if the culture responsible held spiritual or symbolic beliefs connecting death, the afterlife, and the sun's annual cycle. Many ancient societies across vastly different regions and eras drew exactly this kind of connection between solar movement and the journey of the dead, treating astronomical alignment not as separate from funerary practice, but as an integral, meaningful part of how a burial monument expressed its full symbolic intent. Under this kind of combined interpretation, Stenar wouldn't represent a competition between two rival explanations, so much as a single monument carrying multiple layered meanings simultaneously, exactly the kind of complexity we might reasonably expect from a culture sophisticated enough to organize the labor required to move and place 59 multi-ton boulders along a precise, deliberate ship-shaped outline in the first place. And that labor question deserves its own consideration, because moving stones of this size, some weighing close to 2 tons, up onto an elevated coastal ridge without the benefit of wheeled vehicles suited to the terrain or draft animals necessarily documented in connection with this specific construction effort, represents a genuinely significant feat of organized human effort. Whoever oversaw this project commanded enough community resources, enough collective labor, and enough shared cultural motivation to see the work through to completion, arranging each stone with evident care toward the overall ship-shaped design, rather than simply piling boulders together without attention to form. That level of investment suggests the site held real, significant importance to the people who built it, whether that importance centered primarily on honoring someone specific in death, tracking the movement of the sun across the seasons, or, quite plausibly, both purposes intertwined in ways we may not be able to fully separate from this distance in time. Local folklore surrounding Stenar adds another layer, separate from the academic debate, though, as with much oral tradition tied to ancient monuments. It's difficult to determine how far back these specific stories genuinely extend versus how much developed later, after the site's original purpose had already faded from clear communal memory. Some local legends associate the stones with a Viking chieftain or legendary figure named Ali, said to be buried at the site, lending the location its modern name. Other folk traditions describe the stones as having protective or spiritual significance for the surrounding region, treated with a degree of reverence by local communities across generations, separate from whatever formal historical or archaeological explanation might apply. Whether these stories reflect any genuine thread of memory connecting back to the monument's original 6th or 7th century construction, or whether they emerged independently, centuries later, as a way of giving meaning to a striking but already mysterious landmark, remains, like so much else here, difficult to determine with confidence. There's also a question worth raising about why this particular location, this specific clifftop above Koseberga, was chosen for such a significant undertaking in the first place. The elevated position offers a commanding, almost theatrical view out across the Baltic Sea, a visual relationship that seems unlikely to be accidental given how deliberately the rest of the monument appears to have been planned. If the ship setting was intended primarily as a burial marker, this dramatic coastal vantage point would have ensured the monument remained visible to anyone approaching by sea, a fitting, highly visible tribute for someone whose status warranted that kind of lasting, prominent commemoration. If the astronomical theory holds any validity, the clear, unobstructed horizon visible from this elevated position would have been essential for accurately tracking solstice and equinox sunrise and sunset points, something a more enclosed or low-lying location simply couldn't have offered with the same precision. Either way, the location itself seems to reflect the same level of deliberate intention found throughout the rest of the site, reinforcing the sense that nothing about Stenar happened by accident or convenience, but rather through careful, purposeful planning, extending from the overall shape down to its precise geographic placement. Modern archaeological work at Stenar has continued steadily, including geophysical surveys and additional excavation efforts aimed at better understanding the full extent of activity at the site, beyond just the visible stone setting itself. Some of this research has suggested the surrounding area may have held broader ceremonial or social significance beyond the immediate burial monument, potentially functioning as a gathering site for the wider community on certain occasions, though the specific nature and frequency of that activity remains difficult to reconstruct with full confidence from the physical evidence recovered so far. This raises the possibility that Stenar wasn't simply a single, isolated burial marker built once and then left largely undisturbed, but rather an ongoing site of communal significance, potentially visited, maintained, or ceremonially used by the surrounding population across an extended period following its initial construction, long after the individual originally honored by the burial had already passed fully out of living memory. It's also worth noting how Stenar compares and contrasts with other megalithic monuments found elsewhere across Europe during roughly comparable, though not always identical, time periods. Unlike Stonehenge, whose construction phases span thousands of years, and whose purpose appears to have shifted and evolved considerably over that extended timeline, Stenar's construction appears, based on current dating evidence, to represent a more concentrated building effort, situated within a considerably narrower window of late Iron Age Scandinavian history. This distinction matters because it suggests whatever purpose or purposes the monument served were likely conceived and executed by a single generation or closely connected sequence of generations, rather than representing a slowly accumulated, evolving structure shaped by many different cultures and beliefs layered across vast stretches of time, the way some other ancient monuments around the world clearly were. If Stenar does combine burial and astronomical function, that combination likely reflects a unified, coherent set of beliefs held by the specific community responsible for its construction, rather than separate, unrelated purposes imposed at different points by different groups. Today, Stenar remains one of Sweden's most visited archaeological sites, drawing visitors who come specifically to walk the length of the stone ship, trace its outline along the cliff edge, and watch the sun rise or set along the horizon during the solstices, when the alignment theory, whether fully proven or not, draws its largest and most attentive crowds. There's something fitting in that continued ritual of observation, even now, even without full scholarly consensus on whether the alignments are genuinely intentional. Whether or not the original builders specifically designed these stones to track the sun's annual movement with the precision modern visitors now attribute to them, people continue gathering at this clifftop during the solstices, watching the horizon, participating, in their own way, in exactly the kind of seasonal observation the astronomical theory proposes the site was originally built to support. Perhaps that continuity, intentional or coincidental, says something meaningful in itself about how thoroughly this landscape lends itself to exactly that kind of watching and waiting. What remains unresolved after decades of survey work, excavation, astronomical measurement, and continued scholarly disagreement is whether Stenar should be understood primarily as a grave, primarily as a calendar, or as something that was always, from its very conception, meant to be both simultaneously, a monument built specifically to honor the dead through deliberate, careful alignment with the movement of the sun itself, treating astronomical precision not as a separate function layered onto a burial site, but as the very language through which that burial's full meaning was originally expressed. The cremated remains found within the formation confirm someone was honored here. The disputed alignment suggests, without fully proving, that the sun's movement may have mattered just as deeply to whoever made that decision. Standing at the edge of that clifftop today, walking the curved outline of stone from pointed stern to towering stem, looking out across the same stretch of Baltic coastline this monument has faced for somewhere around 1,400 years. It's difficult not to wonder exactly what combination of grief, reverence, and astronomical understanding originally shaped this place into the form it still holds. Was this ship of stone built purely to carry someone symbolically into the afterlife, its resemblance to solar alignment simply an accident of careful design coincidentally read into existence by modern measurement? Or did the people who raised these 59 boulders understand something deliberate and precise about the sun's relationship to death itself, encoding that understanding into stone with an intention we're only now beginning to properly appreciate, even if we can't yet fully prove it? And if the alignments are real, deliberately placed by hands working without modern instruments, relying instead on patient, generational observation of the sky. What else about this clifftop, this ship, this person buried somewhere beneath these stones, still remains quietly unread, waiting for the right solstice, the right angle of light, to finally make itself clear? Stenar left us on a windswept Swedish clifftop, wondering whether stone could be made to speak both for the dead and for the sun. Our next site descends in the opposite direction entirely, not upward toward sky and horizon, but downward, level after level, into the earth itself, in the small village of Abaneri, in the Indian state of Rajasthan. Here, sunk more than 13 stories beneath ground level, lies one of the most visually staggering structures in the ancient world. Baori, a stepwell so vast and so geometrically precise that photographs of it routinely circulate online stripped of context, mistaken by viewers for an Escher drawing rather than an actual physical place. Baori is, in its most basic and verified function, a stepwell, a type of structure unique to the Indian subcontinent, built to provide reliable access to groundwater in a region where seasonal monsoons meant the water table could drop dramatically during dry months. But to describe it simply as a well undersells what's actually here. The structure descends 13 stories, roughly 30 meters, into the earth, lined on three sides by a dizzying lattice of more than 3,500 narrow steps, arranged in a perfectly symmetrical repeating zigzag pattern that creates an almost hypnotic visual effect as it spirals down toward the water at the base. The fourth side holds a multi-story pavilion, once used by royalty, with covered galleries, carved Jarokha balconies, and rooms that historically offered relief from Rajasthan's punishing summer heat, since temperatures at the well's base can run significantly cooler than the surface above. Historical and archaeological consensus generally dates Baori's original construction to the 8th or 9th century AD, attributing it to King Chanda of the Nikumba dynasty, a regional Rajput ruling family, with the structure named after him. Later additions and renovations, particularly to the surrounding pavilion, are generally attributed to subsequent periods of Rajput and possibly later Mughal-influenced architectural work, layered onto the original stepwell over the following centuries. This places Baori among the oldest and largest of India's surviving stepwells, a category of structure that became increasingly elaborate and widespread across western India between roughly the 7th and 19th centuries, serving practical, religious, and social functions simultaneously. Places where water collection intersected with ritual bathing, community gathering, and, for those wealthy enough to commission a pavilion like the one attached here, simple respite from the heat. The engineering achievement involved is, on its own, worth pausing over. Each of the more than 3,500 steps had to be cut and fitted with extraordinary precision, not merely for visual symmetry but for structural integrity. A stepwell of this depth, carved into porous regional stone and subject to fluctuating water levels and seasonal flooding, required builders with sophisticated understanding of load distribution, drainage, and erosion resistance, all achieved without the benefit of modern surveying instruments or construction technology. The double helix-like geometry of the steps wasn't simply decorative ambition. It served the practical purpose of allowing access to the water at virtually any level, regardless of how far the groundwater had receded during a given season, while also moderating airflow and temperature within the deep shaded well shaft itself, creating a natural cooling effect that 9th century builders appear to have understood and deliberately engineered for, centuries before anyone had a scientific vocabulary for thermodynamics. This much is reasonably well established, supported by architectural analysis, regional historical records, and comparison with other surviving stepwells across Rajasthan and Gujarat. Where Baori shifts from documented history into something more genuinely uncertain is in the persistent local and popular claims surrounding hidden passages, sealed chambers, and tunnels said to connect the stepwell to other locations entirely. Claims that circulate widely among visitors and in regional oral tradition, but that have never been confirmed through formal archaeological excavation or survey. The most commonly repeated version of this story holds that a tunnel once ran from the base of Baori to a nearby palace or fort, allowing royal residents private climate-controlled passage down into the well's cooler depths without needing to be seen using the public steps above. Versions of this claim vary depending on who's telling it. Some describe a single connecting passage, while others describe a more extensive network, supposedly linking the stepwell to multiple points across the village or to structures that no longer survive in any recognizable form. None of these claims has been substantiated through documented excavation, and no formal archaeological survey conducted at the site has confirmed the existence of such tunnels. That absence of confirmation, however, isn't quite the same thing as definitive disproof, particularly given how much of Chan Baori's surrounding substructure, the ground beneath and around the visible stepwell itself, has never been comprehensively excavated or surveyed using modern subsurface imaging methods. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it represents a different category of mystery than several of the sites we've already examined. We aren't looking at an established physical feature whose purpose is debated, the way we are with the alignments at Stenar, or the function of Por-Bazhyn's isolated complex. We're looking at a structure whose visible, documented portions are extraordinarily well understood, while persistent claims about what might lie beyond that visible structure remain almost entirely untested by the kind of rigorous archaeological method that could actually confirm or rule them out. Why would such claims persist so consistently across generations if there's nothing behind them at all? One reasonable, fairly mundane explanation is simply that elaborate stepwells like Chan Baori, by their very design, already involve genuine hidden architecture. The pavilion itself contains rooms, corridors, and lower chambers that aren't immediately visible from the main viewing areas, and some of these spaces have, at various points in the site's long history, been closed off, repurposed, or fallen out of public access for reasons related more to maintenance, safety, or shifting administrative priorities than to any deliberate secrecy. It's entirely plausible that stories of hidden passages originated from genuine, if mundane, architectural features within the pavilion complex that simply aren't part of the standard visitor route, and that those genuine but unremarkable closed-off spaces gradually accumulated more dramatic folklore over the centuries, evolving from a locked room in the palace wing into a secret tunnel connecting royal residences to the depths of the well, the kind of embellishment oral tradition tends to apply naturally to genuinely restricted or simply forgotten spaces over enough generations. There's also a more straightforward practical consideration that lends the basic concept at least some plausibility, even without confirmed evidence. Royal architecture across Rajasthan during this general period did sometimes incorporate private, separate access routes for ruling families, distinct from public-facing entrances, particularly for structures combining practical function with elite residential use. Exactly the combination Chan Baori represents through its dual identity as both public stepwell and royal retreat. If such a private passage did exist at some point in the site's history, connecting the pavilion's upper royal quarters more directly to the well's depths, or to a now vanished or unidentified nearby structure, it wouldn't represent an isolated architectural anomaly. It would be broadly consistent with documented patterns of royal building design found elsewhere in the region during comparable periods, even if this specific claimed example has never been physically confirmed. What complicates any definitive answer further is the sheer scale of what surrounds Chan Baori that has, to date, received only limited modern archaeological attention. Abaneri itself sits atop a landscape with a documented history extending back well over 1,000 years, and the village contains other structures, including the nearby Harshat Mata Temple, whose own history intertwines with the stepwells, both reportedly damaged during periods of regional conflict and invasion across the medieval period, with portions of both structures bearing evidence of deliberate destruction, followed by later restoration. A landscape with this much layered history, much of it documented only partially or through fragmented regional record-keeping rather than comprehensive archaeological survey, leaves considerable room for genuine unknowns to persist beneath the surface, literally and figuratively, without requiring any particularly dramatic explanation beyond simple, incomplete investigation. Ground-penetrating radar and other modern subsurface survey techniques, the kind of technology that has helped resolve or at least meaningfully investigate similar persistent local legends at other historic sites around the world, have not, as far as publicly available archaeological records indicate, been comprehensively applied across the full extent of the ground surrounding Chan Baori specifically to test these tunnel claims. This isn't necessarily suspicious in itself. Resources for this kind of detailed subsurface archaeological survey are limited, and prioritization tends to favor sites where there's already strong physical or documentary evidence suggesting something specific worth investigating, rather than sites where the primary evidence is oral tradition and popular legend. But it does mean that, strictly speaking, the question of whether any genuine hidden passage exists at Baori remains formally simply unanswered, neither confirmed nor definitively ruled out, sitting in that uncomfortable space between established fact and persistent local belief that so many of the sites throughout this exploration seem to occupy. It's also worth considering what these stories mean, even if they ultimately prove to have no literal physical basis at all. Across cultures and throughout history, sites of genuine engineering or architectural significance often accumulate exactly this kind of embellished narrative. Stories of hidden chambers, secret passages, and concealed connections that may say less about verifiable physical reality and more about how deeply impressive, even slightly uncanny, structures like Baori tend to affect the people who encounter them. A stepwell descending 13 stories into the earth, its walls covered in thousands of perfectly repeating steps creating an almost dizzying visual pattern when viewed from above, already feels like it shouldn't entirely belong to the ordinary practical category of place where people once collected water. It's not difficult to understand why a structure this visually and architecturally extraordinary would attract stories suggesting it holds even more beneath its visible surface than what tourists and researchers can presently see and measure. And yet, dismissing the tunnel claims entirely, simply because they remain unconfirmed, would mean ignoring a genuine pattern worth noting. In several other documented cases across Rajasthan and broader South Asia, stepwells and associated royal complexes have, upon more thorough excavation, revealed connecting passages, additional sublevels, or sealed chambers that existed for generations, as nothing more than local legend before modern archaeological survey eventually confirmed them. This doesn't prove Baori specifically holds similar secrets, but it does establish that the basic premise, hidden architectural features connected to grand stepwell complexes existing beyond what's immediately visible to visitors, isn't simply fanciful invention without any precedent in the broader archaeological record of the region. The question with Baori specifically isn't whether such features are plausible in this kind of structure generally. It's whether they exist here, at this particular site, and that remains as of now a question without a confirmed answer in either direction. Today, Baori draws a steady stream of visitors and photographers, many specifically seeking out the visual spectacle of its impossible-looking geometric steps, an image that has, in recent years, become something of an internet phenomenon entirely separate from any deeper engagement with the structure's actual history or unresolved questions. Conservation efforts continue to focus primarily on structural preservation, managing erosion, water damage, and the practical challenges of maintaining a structure this old, this deep, and this architecturally complex, exposed for well over 1,000 years to Rajasthan's harsh seasonal extremes. Comprehensive subsurface investigation specifically aimed at resolving the tunnel question hasn't, to date, been prioritized in the same way structural conservation has, leaving the legends to persist largely as they have for generations, neither confirmed nor disproven, simply carried forward by local memory and repeated with varying levels of embellishment to each new wave of visitors who descend partway down those dizzying steps and look back up at the pavilion, wondering, perhaps, exactly what the people who once lived there might have been able to reach without ever using the public stairs at all. Standing at the edge of Baori, looking down across thousands of steps folding into geometric shadow toward water still resting at the base after more than 1,000 years, it's genuinely difficult to separate the well-documented engineering brilliance of what's visible from the lingering, unresolved question of what might still exist just beyond it, sealed somewhere in the ground surrounding this extraordinary structure, waiting for the right survey, the right excavation, the right moment of modern attention, finally directed where local memory has long insisted something more remains to be found. Was there ever truly a private passage connecting royalty to these depths, used and then deliberately sealed away as priorities shifted across centuries of changing rule? Or is this simply the natural mythology that gathers around any place built to feel as impossible as this one still does? Even now, even fully explained. Either way, the steps keep descending, the water keeps waiting at the bottom, and the ground around Chonburi, largely unexamined by the tools that might finally settle the question, keeps its own quiet counsel. Chonburi left us peering down into engineered depths, wondering what the ground around it might still be hiding. Our final stop doesn't ask you to imagine descent. It puts you inside it. In the rugged foothills of Mount Sahand, in northwestern Iran's East Azerbaijan province, sits a village that doesn't look like it was built so much as grown directly out of the mountainside. This is Kandovan, and unlike every other site we've examined tonight, it isn't a ruin. People still live here, inside conical rock formations carved out of volcanic stone, in homes that may have been continuously inhabited for longer than most cities on Earth have existed at all. From a distance, Kandovan looks almost otherworldly. A cluster of tall, tapering rock spires, some reaching 10 meters or more in height, rising from the valley floor in formations that resemble something between giant termite mounds and natural rock chimneys. These are volcanic tuff cones, formed originally through the eruption and subsequent erosion of ash and pumice from Mount Sahand, a now dormant stratovolcano whose activity shaped this entire region over tens of thousands of years. The cones themselves are entirely natural in origin, the product of geological processes with no human involvement whatsoever. What's not natural, what makes Kandovan extraordinary rather than simply scenic, is what people did with them afterward. Carving directly into the soft volcanic rock to create multi-room dwellings, complete with windows, doorways, interior staircases connecting different levels, and even space for livestock on lower floors, all hollowed out from solid stone rather than constructed from separately gathered materials. This single fact, that homes here are subtractive rather than additive, carved out of existing rock rather than built up from bricks, timber, or quarried stone transported from elsewhere, places Kandovan in a fairly small category of inhabited troglodyte settlements found around the world, comparable in concept, though not in specific architecture, to cave-dwelling communities documented in places like Cappadocia in central Turkey. But where many cave-dwelling sites elsewhere have been abandoned, preserved as historical curiosities rather than living communities, Kandovan has remained continuously occupied, with residents reportedly still living in some of these rock homes today, maintaining a way of life that has, by most accounts, persisted with remarkable continuity across an extraordinarily long span of time. And that's precisely where the certainty starts to thin out, because establishing exactly how long people have lived inside these cones turns out to be considerably harder than simply pointing to the rock formations themselves and declaring an age. Local tradition in Kandovan offers a fairly specific origin story, one repeated consistently enough across generations that it functions almost as accepted regional history. That the village was first settled roughly 700 years ago during the Mongol invasions that swept through this region in the 13th century, when local populations are said to have fled into the rock formations of Mount Sahand, seeking refuge from advancing Mongol forces, carving out shelters in the volcanic cones as a defensive measure against an immediate, violent threat, only to find the resulting dwellings practical enough and defensible enough to remain in permanently once the danger had passed. This explanation carries genuine historical plausibility. The Mongol invasions of the 13th century were catastrophic across large portions of Persia, and documented historical accounts from the period describe widespread displacement, with local populations fleeing into mountainous defensible terrain throughout the region precisely to escape advancing forces. Naturally formed rock spires offering pre-existing vertical structure, requiring only interior excavation rather than full construction from raw materials, would have represented a genuinely efficient refuge option for a population needing shelter quickly, under immediate threat, without the time or resources to build conventional housing from scratch. But here's the complication that keeps Kandovan from settling neatly into that 7th century timeline. Comprehensive archaeological dating specifically targeting the earliest excavated chambers within the cones has been limited, and some researchers and regional historians have suggested the settlement's true origins may extend considerably further back than the Mongol-era refugee narrative implies, potentially by centuries, with the 13th century displacement representing not the village's founding moment, but rather a significant period of expansion or renewed habitation layered onto dwellings that may have already existed in some more limited form, well before the Mongol invasions arrived in the region at all. This kind of uncertainty isn't unusual for continuously inhabited sites, and it's worth pausing on why. Unlike an abandoned ruin, where archaeologists can excavate undisturbed layers and apply radiocarbon dating to organic material trapped in a stable, sealed context, an actively lived-in settlement like Kandovan presents a fundamentally different kind of challenge. The rock chambers have been continuously modified, expanded, repaired, and repurposed by successive generations of residents for hundreds of years, each renovation potentially disturbing or removing the kind of clear stratigraphic evidence that would otherwise help establish a more precise founding date. Living spaces get smoothed, deepened, widened, and updated according to the practical needs of whoever currently occupies them, which means the very continuity that makes Kandovan so remarkable, the fact that people never left, also makes it considerably harder to scientifically pin down exactly when they first arrived. There's also a deeper question lurking beneath the dating debate, one that connects Kandovan to a broader, more universal pattern we've encountered repeatedly throughout this exploration. How much of what we accept as a site's documented history actually traces back to verified physical evidence, and how much rests primarily on oral tradition, repeated consistently enough across generations that it eventually hardens into accepted historical fact, whether or not it can be independently confirmed through archaeological method. The Mongol refuge origin story for Kandovan is widely repeated in tourist literature, in regional historical accounts, and by residents themselves describing their own community's history. That widespread consistency lends it credibility, but consistency in oral tradition isn't the same thing as physical proof, and the honest archaeological position, as it currently stands, is that the specific founding date of Kandovan's earliest dwellings remains less precisely established than the confident, frequently repeated 700 years figure might suggest to a casual visitor. What is more solidly documented is the settlement's relationship to its immediate environment, and this is where Kandovan's story becomes genuinely fascinating beyond simple questions of age. The volcanic tuff that forms these cones possesses unusual thermal properties, retaining cool temperatures during summer months and providing meaningful insulation against winter cold. A practical advantage that would have made these rock dwellings genuinely comfortable, not merely defensible, across the full range of seasonal extremes this mountainous region experiences. Nearby mineral springs, fed by the same volcanic geology responsible for the cones themselves, have historically attracted visitors seeking their reputed therapeutic properties, adding an economic and social dimension to the settlement's continued occupation beyond pure shelter, suggesting Kandovan's persistence across centuries may owe as much to genuine practical environmental advantage as to any single historical refugee crisis that may have first driven people into the rock. This raises a question worth sitting with. If the volcanic cones offered such clear, sustained practical benefits, climate control, defensibility, proximity to mineral springs, durable construction requiring minimal ongoing material input, why hasn't more historical or archaeological attention been directed toward establishing precisely when humans first recognized and exploited these advantages? Why does a settlement this old, this distinctive and still actively inhabited today, remain comparatively under-researched relative to other ancient dwelling sites around the world that have received far more sustained scholarly investigation despite being, in many cases, considerably less unique? Part of the answer likely lies in exactly the same tension we've seen elsewhere throughout this exploration. Living sites tend to receive less invasive archaeological attention than abandoned ones, partly out of respect for current residents' privacy and ongoing use of their homes, and partly because the practical and ethical complications of excavating beneath or within someone's actively occupied living space are considerably greater than excavating a long-abandoned ruin with no current inhabitants to consider. Kandovan's continued habitation, the very feature that makes it so remarkable, may also be precisely what has limited how thoroughly researchers have been able to scientifically establish its full history, leaving significant portions of that history resting on oral tradition and architectural inference, rather than the kind of rigorous, controlled excavation applied to comparable but uninhabited ancient sites. There's also the matter of what may lie beneath the inhabited levels themselves, a question that, like the tunnel speculation surrounding Baori, exists more in the realm of local discussion and limited preliminary investigation than confirmed archaeological survey. Some residents and regional historians have described lower chambers and connecting passages within certain cone formations that extend below the currently used living spaces, potentially representing earlier phases of excavation predating the dwellings currently in active use above them. Whether these lower spaces represent genuinely older occupation layers, simply unused storage areas carved at a later date for practical rather than historical reasons, or some combination of both, hasn't been comprehensively documented through systematic archaeological survey extending across the full settlement. Given how limited broader excavation at Kandovan has been overall, this remains, much like several other threads we've followed throughout tonight's exploration, a genuine open question rather than a settled answer in either direction. It's worth considering, too, what continuity itself tells us here, separate from the specific dating debate. Whatever its precise founding date, Kandovan represents something genuinely unusual among the sites we've explored tonight. A place where the original human relationship with an extraordinary natural formation never actually ended. The people who carved these chambers, whether 700 years ago or considerably earlier, established a way of living that has been maintained, adapted, and passed down through enough successive generations that it remains a lived reality today, rather than a historical curiosity excavated from beneath later layers of unrelated habitation. Every other site we've examined tonight asks us to reconstruct a lost relationship between ancient builders and the land they shaped, working backward from physical remains toward people whose specific beliefs, names, and reasons have slipped entirely out of reach. Kandovan offers something rarer, a living thread, however incompletely documented its earliest links may be, connecting whoever first recognized the practical and perhaps spiritual significance of these volcanic spires directly forward to families who still wake up each morning inside rock their distant ancestors, by whatever timeline turns out to be accurate, once carved by hand. And yet, that living continuity doesn't resolve the underlying mystery so much as it reframes it. We can walk through Kandovan today, speak with residents, observe firsthand how these remarkable dwellings function in daily, practical use. What we still can't do with full archaeological confidence is point to a specific date and say with certainty, this is when it began. This is who carved the first chamber. This is exactly why they chose this particular formation among the many volcanic features scattered across this region. The Mongol-era refuge story may well be entirely accurate. It may also represent a later simplified explanation layered onto a settlement whose actual origins reach back further into a past too distant and too poorly documented through this specific period of regional history to fully reconstruct with the same confidence. Modern Iran has increasingly recognized Kandovan's significance, both as a UNESCO-recognized cultural heritage candidate and as a growing destination for visitors drawn by the same striking visual quality that first caught our attention at the start of this section, those tall, tapering cones rising improbably from the valley floor. That growing attention brings both opportunity and complication, the same tension we've seen play out at other increasingly visited sites throughout this exploration. Greater resources and interest potentially enabling more thorough future archaeological investigation, balanced against the practical reality of a living community whose homes aren't simply historical artifacts to be excavated and studied, but actual, present-day houses where people still sleep, cook, and raise families inside walls of ancient volcanic stone. Standing in Kandovan today, looking up at these towering rock cones with their carved windows catching afternoon light, smoke occasionally rising from a chimney cut directly through solid stone, it's difficult not to feel the particular weight of a mystery that isn't locked away behind sealed entrances or buried beneath centuries of undisturbed earth. but is instead simply being lived, quietly, by people who may themselves hold pieces of an answer that formal archaeology has yet to fully confirm. How far back does this relationship between people and this mountainside genuinely extend? Did fear and displacement truly carve the first chamber 7 centuries ago into stone that had stood untouched for tens of thousands of years before that? Or did someone, long before any Mongol army ever approached this valley, already understand what this volcanic rock could offer, beginning a relationship with this mountainside that simply never had a reason to end? Perhaps the truest answer is one we'll never fully separate from the people still living inside it. The line where Kandovan's documented history runs out and its lived, ongoing story continues may not be a line at all, but a single, unbroken thread the volcano itself has been quietly holding, since long before anyone thought to ask when it began. Kandovan left us with a mystery that never stopped being lived in, a question still breathing inside the homes that hold it. Our final sight returns us to silence, to stone that has stood empty and unmoving for thousands of years, in the town of Antequera, in the Malaga province of southern Spain. Here, beneath an earthen mound that has watched over this landscape since long before the pyramids of Egypt rose from the desert, sits Menga, one of the largest and most structurally audacious megalithic monuments anywhere in Europe, and a site whose builders accomplished something that, even now, with full modern engineering analysis available, still doesn't entirely make sense. Menga is a dolmen, a category of ancient megalithic tomb found across Atlantic and Mediterranean Europe, typically constructed from large upright stone slabs supporting one or more horizontal capstones, the whole structure originally covered by an earthen mound, or tumulus, that in most surviving examples has eroded away over millennia, leaving only the bare stone skeleton visible today. Menga, remarkably, has retained much of its original covering mound, giving visitors something closer to the structure's intended ancient appearance than most comparable sites elsewhere in Europe can offer. But it's what lies beneath that mound that has occupied archaeologists and engineers for well over a century, because Menga isn't simply large for a dolmen. It is, by a considerable margin, one of the largest and heaviest megalithic structures ever built using this particular architectural method anywhere in the ancient world. The numbers alone are worth sitting with before moving any further. Menga's main chamber and entrance passage stretch approximately 27.5 meters in length, constructed from 32 megalithic stones, with the largest single capstone weighing an estimated 180 tons. To put that in perspective, that single stone alone weighs roughly as much as 30 fully grown adult elephants, and it isn't simply lying on the ground. It rests, suspended essentially in place, atop upright support stones, forming a covered passage tall and wide enough to walk through, leading toward an inner chamber that would have served, according to the prevailing archaeological interpretation, as a collective burial space for a community whose individual names and specific beliefs have been lost entirely to the roughly 5,700 years separating their world from ours. Radiocarbon dating and associated archaeological analysis place Menga's construction at approximately 3700 to 3600 BC, situating it firmly within the Neolithic period, predating the pyramids of Giza by well over 1,000 years, predating Stonehenge's earliest construction phases by a significant margin as well. This timeline alone reframes the entire conversation around what we generally assume Neolithic societies, working without metal tools, without the wheel as a load-bearing technology, without draft animals confirmed to have been domesticated and trained for this kind of heavy construction work in the region at this specific period, were actually capable of achieving when sufficiently organized and motivated. This is where Menga stops being merely impressive and starts becoming genuinely difficult to fully explain. Moving and precisely positioning a 180-ton stone is an engineering challenge that would tax modern construction equipment without careful planning. Achieving it roughly 5,700 years ago, using whatever combination of timber rollers, earthen ramps, coordinated human labor, and rope-based leverage systems Neolithic builders had available, represents a feat of applied physics and logistics that some modern engineers, upon close examination, have described as genuinely difficult to fully reconstruct, using only the methods traditionally assumed available to societies of this period and region. Mainstream archaeological consensus generally holds that Menga's builders accomplished this through exactly the kind of labor-intensive, carefully organized methods documented or reasonably inferred at other megalithic sites across Neolithic Europe. Large earthen ramps built up gradually to allow stones to be dragged into position using sheer accumulated manpower, rope, and timber leverage, with the ramps then removed once the stones were correctly placed, leaving only the finished megalithic structure visible afterward. This explanation is broadly consistent with evidence recovered at other comparable Neolithic sites, and it doesn't require proposing technology beyond what we already have reasonable evidence Neolithic societies elsewhere were capable of organizing, given sufficient population size, social coordination, and sustained, multi-generational commitment to a single monumental project. But Menga raises the bar on this explanation considerably, simply through scale. The 180-ton capstone exceeds, by a wide margin, the weight of capstones found at most other European dolmens, including other large and well-studied examples across Iberia, Britain, and Ireland. This means that whatever methods were employed at Menga weren't simply standard Neolithic construction technique applied at a slightly larger scale. They represent something closer to the absolute upper limit of what purely manual, pre-metal, pre-wheel construction methods could plausibly achieve, pushed to a degree that few, if any other confirmed Neolithic monuments anywhere in Europe come close to matching. Some engineers and archaeologists studying the site have noted that achieving this level of precision, moving and positioning stones of this mass without modern equipment, without metal tools for fine shaping the load-bearing surfaces, would have required not just brute manpower, but a genuinely sophisticated, almost mathematical understanding of weight distribution, structural stability, and controlled, incremental movement. Knowledge that would have needed to be developed, tested, and refined through what was presumably considerable prior experience. Experience for which we have surprisingly little surviving physical evidence in the form of smaller, preparatory megalithic projects that might logically have preceded an undertaking this ambitious. That gap between the sophistication clearly required to build Menga and the comparatively limited evidence of a gradual technological progression leading up to it is part of what keeps the site genuinely unresolved rather than simply impressively old. Where did this specific community acquire the engineering knowledge necessary for a project this audacious? Was Menga the culmination of a long, now largely undocumented tradition of progressively larger megalithic experimentation in the region, with smaller, less durable predecessor structures having long since eroded away or been dismantled for later building material, leaving Menga as the sole, dramatic survivor of a building tradition we can no longer fully trace? Or did this community achieve something closer to a singular, exceptional engineering leap, accomplished once, at this specific scale, through circumstances, knowledge, or organizational capacity that simply isn't well represented anywhere else in the regional archaeological record from this period? There's a further layer of genuine mystery here that goes beyond pure engineering capability, and it concerns orientation. Menga's entrance and main passage are aligned not toward the rising or setting sun at the solstices, the kind of solar alignment we examined at Stenar, and that appears at numerous other Neolithic and Bronze Age monuments across Europe, but instead toward a specific, prominent natural landmark on the horizon, a distinctive anthropomorphic mountain formation known locally as La Peña de los Enamorados, the Lover's Rock, whose silhouette, viewed from certain angles, bears a resemblance to a reclining human face or figure. This alignment was confirmed through detailed archaeological and astronomical survey work, most notably research published in the 2010s by researchers including Michael Hoskin, and later more detailed analysis examining the precision of this specific sightline, establishing that Menga's builders deliberately oriented this massive structure, with all the engineering precision that orientation demanded, toward a landform rather than toward any celestial event. This is a genuinely unusual choice within the broader context of European megalithic architecture, where solar and lunar alignment dominates the documented pattern at comparable sites. Why would a community capable of this level of engineering precision choose to orient their most significant monumental undertaking toward a mountain rather than toward the sun? What significance did La Peña de los Enamorados hold for the people who built Menga, sufficient to make it, rather than the more commonly observed celestial cycle, the defining directional reference for a structure requiring this much sustained communal investment? Local legend, layered on far more recently than the Neolithic period itself, associates the mountain with a tragic story of forbidden love. Two young people from opposing communities who, according to the tale, fled together to the mountain's peak and chose to leap from its heights rather than be separated, a story almost certainly originating many thousands of years after Menga's construction, but one that nonetheless reflects, perhaps coincidentally, perhaps not entirely, how deeply this particular landform has continued to hold symbolic, almost personified significance for the people living in its shadow across an extraordinarily long stretch of regional history. Archaeological excavation within Menga's chamber, conducted across multiple campaigns since the structure was first formally investigated in the 19th century, has recovered human remains representing what researchers estimate to be several hundred individuals, interred over what was likely an extended period of continued use following the monument's initial construction, alongside stone tools, ceramic fragments, and other grave goods consistent with Neolithic burial practice documented elsewhere in the region. This supports the broadly accepted interpretation of Menga as a collective tomb, a structure built to house the dead of an entire community across multiple generations, rather than a single individual burial, similar in basic social function, if not in scale, to the burial purpose proposed at Stenar, though Menga's construction predates that Scandinavian ship setting by roughly 4,300 years. What Menga doesn't fully explain, even with this burial function established, is why a community would commit this level of engineering ambition, resources, and almost certainly significant risk to human life during the construction process itself, toward housing their dead specifically in a structure of this unprecedented scale, when smaller, less logistically demanding dolmens elsewhere across contemporary Neolithic Europe clearly served comparable burial functions without requiring anything close to a 180-ton capstone. Scale, in monumental architecture, typically signals something beyond pure function. It usually communicates status, power, or spiritual significance that the builders considered worth the enormous additional investment scale demands. If Menga's function was fundamentally similar to smaller, contemporary dolmens found throughout the broader region, what specific factor, religious belief, political consolidation, perhaps a desire to permanently and visibly claim this particular landscape in full view of La Peña de los Enamorados, drove this one community to push their engineering and organizational capacity this much further than their neighbors apparently felt necessary? Recent archaeological work has continued adding complexity rather than resolving these questions cleanly. Excavations conducted in the 2000s and 2010s identified a deep shaft, originally dug through solid bedrock to a depth of roughly 19.5 meters, located within Menga's interior chamber, a feature whose original purpose remains genuinely debated among researchers studying the site. Some have proposed the shaft may have served a practical function related to water access, potentially connecting to the local water table and offering Menga's builders or later users reliable access to water from within the sealed monument itself, a theory that would suggest an additional, unexpected layer of practical sophistication built into a structure already understood primarily as a tomb. Others have suggested the shaft may have held more symbolic or ritual significance, perhaps connected to underworld or afterlife beliefs associated with the burial function of the chamber surrounding it. The shaft's exact original purpose, much like several other elements of Menga's design, remains, as of current published research, not fully and conclusively resolved. There's something fitting in closing our exploration here, with a monument built not to mark a single life or a single moment, but to house an entire community across countless generations, oriented deliberately toward a mountain whose silhouette has apparently held meaning to the people living beneath it for a span of time so vast that documented legend and verified archaeology blur together at the edges, neither fully explaining the other. Menga has stood, largely intact, for roughly 5,700 years, longer than written language has existed in most parts of the world, longer than most of the civilizations and structures we've examined throughout this entire exploration tonight. It has watched the rise and fall of cultures that came long after its builders had already been forgotten. And it remains standing now, its 180-ton capstone still perfectly balanced exactly where Neolithic hands first placed it, using methods we can reasonably theorize but still cannot fully and confidently reconstruct. What does it mean that a community working without metal, without the wheel, without any written record we've ever recovered, achieved something this enduring, this precisely engineered and oriented it not toward the predictable universal cycle of the sun, but toward a single, specific mountain that apparently mattered enough to shape the entire structure around it? Were they marking territory, honoring a belief we no longer have access to, or responding to something about that particular landform that modern eyes, looking at the same silhouette today, simply can't perceive the way they once did? And if a civilization without writing, without metal, without the wheel could achieve something this lasting, this deliberate, and still leave us this uncertain about their fundamental motivations, what does that suggest about every other site we've walked through tonight? The holes cut into Peruvian hillside, the twisted trees of Vottovaara, the stone jars scattered across Laotian grassland, the carved chamber beneath Royston, the geometric shapes etched into Kazakh steppe, the ship of stone facing the Baltic, the stepwell descending into Rajasthani earth, the living cones still occupied on a Persian mountainside. How much of what remains unexplained across all 10 of these places isn't a failure of our methods, our technology, or our patience, but simply the natural, unavoidable consequence of trying to fully understand people who never expected and never needed anyone this far removed from their world to understand them at all.